Earlier this week, we reported on a situation that looks like it may be coming to a head in just over a week. Some miners in southern Oregon have been given a deadline to clear out of a mine that they've had since the 1870s. There's a clear chain of title, and the miners are asking for a legal explanation from the BLM, and they're not getting it. Oath keepers have taken up a defensive posture there, one of providing security to try to make sure that nothing is going to happen until they can hear this through the court system. We're going to talk to Kirby Jackson from the Glease Mining District. He's going to define for us what the mining district is. You'll be surprised, it's not just an association. He's also going to give us a history of what's been going on in the area, and you're going to see yet again how in 21st century America, bureaucracies are taking upon themselves to not only write the laws, but enforce the laws and have their own court systems. We no longer have a government of by and for the people. We have a government of bureaucrats who are running this by themselves, for themselves, to create their empire. So joining us now is Kirby Jackson from the Glease Mining District. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Jackson. I guess one of the things we need to do first is kind of lay this out for the audience, because most people are not really familiar with what's going on in mining. Let's start with the Glease Mining District. This is not a club. It's not an association of miners. Tell us what this is.
I am the recorder of what is referred to as the Glease Mining District. Way back in 1872, when Congress first established the mining law, basically what they did at the time, all the miners on the ground, they were outlaws. They were regarded as squatters, and they had actually organized the first governments in a lot of these mining areas here. You know, we had mining camps and things like that. So the mining districts originally, they were the first governments in a lot of these areas before the counties and the states came about. So in 1866, when Congress drafted their first mining law, it was actually really just a federal recognition of what the miners were already doing on the ground, because, you know, our forerunners, they were the first government guys out here when we had an early frontier society. So Congress, when they recognized what the miners were doing, that's what they decided was the best thing to do. They recognized these mining districts, and they, more or less, it was the first time in history that any government in the world had actually recognized that the miners who were working the land should also have the right to establish the rules and regulations as far as how they obtained their property, how they maintained their property, and basically how they settled grievances among themselves.
Okay, so you've got a lot of you've got a lot of different small mines that are there, and this is essentially, as you point out on your website, it's an organization of self-government. But it's a little bit different for people, because a lot of, you know, what we're looking at in the cities and the counties, a lot of people don't really understand, just like they didn't understand at the Bundy Ranch, that there are different kinds of property rights. You're not saying that you own everything there. You've got mining rights, just like he had grazing rights or water rights. We have hunters who have rights to hunt as they're on the land. So there's all these different multiple uses that can exist on public lands at the same time, right?
That's right. And basically what the mining law did when it was first established, the main core of it was finally refined in 1872 in what is typically called the General Mining Act of 1872, and that's not its proper name. It was had a very long name Congress had that they gave to it, and that's not important. But basically what they did was they established the first rights of miners, and what they recognized at the time was that, like other settlers, such as homesteaders and woodsmen who were making their living by harvesting trees, or they were getting rocks, they basically recognized that these early settlers, they should have protection under the law. And so basically they wanted to define those rights. So the early rights of the miners were they not only had the right to go out on the lands out here, which were held in trust by the government for the people, and that's still the way it's supposed to work. And obviously this is part of the problem we have now, is that it's no longer the government doesn't want to treat it the same way. So basically at that time, Congress, they recognized that we need to establish what these guys have in the way of rights. So early on, they established that the miner had the right to go out and find these minerals. He had the right to develop his property for his benefit, which in turn would benefit the nation. And in return, he would have some protection under the law from whether it's the government or other miners or other users. And basically what they recognized was that in addition to that, early on, the miners had what they called exclusive possession and enjoyment of their property within the lines of their claim. And the way it works, you go out upon the land you find an area that's unclaimed, and you go out there and you look for minerals. And if you find a valuable deposit of them that you think is worth your time doing, you have the right to claim that, and that's done by recording it, filing a location, posting a location notice on the site.
So just kind of, exactly, just kind of recording it just like you would if you're going to buy land to put your house on. And here in Texas, for example, it's very common when we buy a home that those mineral rights do not transfer. They're held by previous people. So we all need to understand, as people are looking at this, that there's different levels of property rights even on the same piece of land. And we also need to understand that a government that doesn't recognize our property rights will treat us as if we were property, will treat us as if we were slaves. So to cap this up, these miners went out there in about 150 years ago, and about the time of the Civil War, they're mining this. They set this up as governments. Congress recognizes this officially in 1872, but then we have this thing called the BLM that's created to ostensibly manage federal lands. And let's go to 1955. In 1955, there's a Surface Resources Act, and I think this has something to do, at least the BLM is claiming that it has something to do with this particular case. So explain that to us, and explain how this older mine, which goes back to the early 1870s, is grandfathered in and not affected by this 1955 Surface Act.
Right, yeah, so the 1955 Surface Resources Act, this actually has everything to do with it, and we agree with BLM that it does have everything to do with it. So in 1955, Congress was starting to recognize that there were an awful lot of people out there. They were basically what they were doing, they were abusing the mining law. They were using the mining law to build private hunting cabins, to squat on land. And needless to say, there were a lot of conflicts with other people who wanted to use the public land system. So Congress decided to change the mining law. And what they decided to do was that all claims that were located by miners and filed after that time, July 23rd, 1955, they had the right to use the surface, but they did not have a surface control or control of the resources, and basically full willy-nilly utilization of those surfaces, and obviously the vegetative surfaces especially is what they were referring to. So needless to say, the claims that were filed after that, they changed from the original meaning within the mining law, and that is something that still continues to this day. But they had to deal with the claims that were already there, and that is where this issue comes in. So Congress, they came up with 3 ideas, and these ideas they came up with, these were largely suggestions of the United States Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. And the 3 things they came up with is that basically they recognized that they couldn't just tell these miners, hey, we're here now, you've had this all along, we're going to start taking your rights away. They didn't do that, or they didn't intend to do that. Mm-hmm. And so basically they provided some mechanisms for the miners to either, on one hand, they could say, I relinquish my surface rights back to the government, and I'm going to allow the general public to come out of my claim and camp here and, get cut firewood, things of that nature, subject to whatever the agency's rules are. So that was one option. Another option was the miner could say, well, I don't really want to deal with this anymore, so I'm just going to give up my claim. That was the second option. Now, the third option, and this was the option that was best suited for most miners if they were serious, they could preserve their existing rights. And how this was done, it was done by filing with the BLM or the U.S. Forest Service what was called a verified statement. And the verified statement was basically the miner informing the government, hey, I am over here, and I'm going to maintain my rights. And what was done at that time, the government then had the opportunity to go in and try to challenge those rights if they found there was a conflict with other uses, such as timber harvesting or public recreation or wildlife management or something to that extent. And needless to say, there were avenues where the government could go down. They could challenge the validity of the claim and basically say, you're not really a miner, you're somebody else, you're just a guy abusing the mining law. And needless to say, the government set up guidelines that they had to follow to either basically to take that surface away from the miners. Okay,
that's good. Now let's talk about this specific case, the Sugar Pine mine. This is the one where we have the conflict. Am I correct to say
Okay.
that the BLM is saying that because of we're exercising these surface rights regulations, and yet you're saying that the sugar pine mine has already registered in a grandfather clause position, right? Is that correct?
That's correct. So the sugar pine is actually, it was the first hard rock gold mine discovered in the state of Oregon, and that was back in 1858. And it went through some assorted owners between 1858 and 1876, and there was a lot of changes of ownership. And even though sometimes the mine wasn't being worked, there were miners who had various property interests on the claim, such as there were 2 arastas on the property. There were some ditches previous miners had dug. There was a water wheel on it at that time. And needless to say, a lot of those rights, they were preserved. But on February 9th, 1876, there were 2 men by the name of George Green and Dan Devilbiss, and they decided that they wanted ownership of the sugar pine, and they adhered to the mining law, and they did what they were required to do. They went up there and they discovered minerals, and they basically staked and recorded their claim. So they recorded that 76, and they also arranged with the previous, with some previous owners as far as those ditches and things of that nature, which were property or obtained them. So that is, this mine has been active and has maintained a current chain of title since those 2 individuals, February 9th, 1876. Dan Devilbiss, who was a co-locator on that claim, he actually sold out to George Green's brother.
Let's
Dan.
go back. Let's go back. I understand it's had a long chain of command. Let's go back to what just happened in March with the cease and desist order from the BLM. Tell us about what the BLM is saying, or can you, I've seen from your press releases, you're saying that you can't get any specific information from them as to what the legal basis is for them to say that the sugar pine mine needs to cease and desist operation.
Well, it's both. I'll tell you what actually started this is the owners have been actively, have been under current ownership for 3 years. They've owned the mine for 3 years from the previous owner, and we have a complete chain of title all the way back. And they've spent a lot of money, and we've all spent a lot of time doing research to establish that. And BLM does not dispute that the chain of title is that long. That's one thing to point out. Even they don't dispute that. And basically what happened was off and on, George Backus, who was one of the co-owners, he's actually had fairly regular contact with BLM since he became the owner. And even before, because there's quite a bit to the situation, and needless to say, he was in contact with them, and he had even spoken to employees such as Diane Perry at Medford BLM, which is our local BLM district here, and she was quite well aware that he was there and what his intentions were, and that basically, George's background, he has a lot of heavy equipment operation background as far as road building. That's what George used to do, was he used to build logging roads until the timber industry was destroyed here. So needless to say, they were very well aware of that. What kind of sparked this, even though George had actually maintained pretty routine contact with the local BLM people, and I've spoken in the past to local archaeologists and stuff, and they were certainly aware of George's ownership, and I think they kind of had a basic idea of.
Yeah, give us an idea, because we're gonna run out of time shortly here. Kirby, give us an idea of what the BLM is saying. Certainly they recognize that this is a very long chain of title. What are they complaining about here?
Basically what happened is there were 2 of their employees came out to the area, and they actually ran into the mine caretaker, but opposed to going to his front door and knocking on the front door and saying, hey, we're BLM guys, we're here, we have to do some work in the area. They basically disregarded that, and they started poking around the camp and didn't identify themselves when they left. And the caretaker called the owners, and he says, hey, I have these people, they're trespassers, what do you want me to do? And the owners said, please stop them, find out who these people are, because we have our economy locally is devastated. We have a lot of problems with thievery and vandalism and things like that. And the owners were very concerned, and he said, please find out who these guys are. I'm on the way.
So basically they challenged their authority, and that made them mad? Is that what you believe instigated all this?
That's pretty much what it is, is basically as these 2 guys were coming out, they were on quads behind 2 locked gates, and the caretaker took his truck, he blocked the road, and he stepped out in front of the truck, and he had a pistol at his side in his hand. He didn't have a holster, but he just held his pistol at his side, and he waited for him, and they rolled up, and he said, I'm the caretaker here. I need to know who you are and what you're doing. You're running around the